In this video, we're diving into the next 5 books in our journey through the Bible. We ended the last session with the Exodus story, the coming out. And now, today, in this video, we're going to think about settling into the promised land, the establishment of the people and the kingship and the pinnacle of the nation of Israel. We're talking about the part of human history when God's people stopped wandering in the wilderness and started living in the land that God had promised them. You see, we've been following this story, a story of hope in a world that has often felt hopeless. You'll remember that salvation came through Joseph, but soon after, slavery followed. Under a new Pharaoh, God's people were enslaved, and yet God intervened, another rescue. He led them towards freedom, but what is it that happened next? I want us to think about how God's rescue isn't just about taking his people away from something, but about bringing them into something. It's like when somebody says to you, you really need to stop eating chocolate. Now that, as a prohibition in itself, is handy, it's useful, but how much better when someone makes a suggestion of what you should eat instead? Perhaps have fruit. Or me, when I'm chatting with my kids and I tell them, stop staring at your screen, stop watching YouTube, playing computer games. Useful, perhaps, in terms of helping their brains reset a little, but how much more useful when I provide an alternative? Go outside, enjoy nature, smell the flowers. You see, God not only saves us from something, but he redirects us towards life. He saves us into his life. And the promise that God made the people wasn't just rescue from Egypt. It wasn't just freedom from that slavery. It was to bring them back into their land, to plant them in that fertile soil. And that's where we find ourselves when we enter into the book of Joshua. There's a clear link between the book of Joshua and what has gone before. Joshua chapter 1 verse 1 says, now Moses, my servant, is dead. We're moving into the next section chronologically. It's easy for us to understand. The book is picking up the story exactly where Deuteronomy left off, continuing the journey of God's people into their inheritance. And to help us sort of think how these books, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Samuel, Kings, fit together, again, we can think about them in 3 distinct sections. There's this first section of going into the land, taking the land, and settling in the land. That's sort of covered in the time period of the book of Joshua, Judges, and the book of Ruth. Then comes the age of the kings. In the book of Samuel, we read the transition from judges to a kingship. And then in the end, we read about the crescendo, the high point of that kingship, and the beginning of the descent, the fall. We read about that a little bit in the book of Kings. So let's start by thinking about the taking and the settling that we find in Joshua and Judges and Ruth. In the book of Joshua, we see the Israelites cross the Jordan River. It mirrors that earlier crossing as they'd come out of Egypt through the Red Sea. In fact, it's symbolic of creation, of something new being birthed through the waters. They're leaving the wilderness, the wild, and they're stepping into what God is crafting for them. One of the most iconic moments in all of the book of Joshua is the battle for the city of Jericho. In an unquestionable act of God's miraculous intervention, the walls of Jericho come crumbling down and God begins to dismantle what rebellious humanity had built. And in its place, he begins to replace it with a people who follow the true God. Only as we read the story, we recognize, and Joshua, the leader of the people, recognizes as well, that following God is not something that automatically happens in us. He challenges the people towards the end of the book of Joshua, choose this day whom you will serve. The God of heaven, the God of creation, the God of the rescue from Egypt, the God of deliverance in so many battles in the book of Joshua, or yourself, your own wisdom, your own ideas and understanding about where life is found and where life comes from. Sadly, the only thing that seems inevitable in the book of Joshua and the book of Judges is that the people have a tendency to turn away from God rather than following him. In the book of Joshua, there are real glimpses of the stubbornness, the same rebellious spirit that has plagued people for generations. But when we flip over into the book of Judges, we see it all the more. You see, in the book of Judges, we encounter cycle after cycle after cycle of rebellion. Over and over again, the Israelites turn away from God and they choose to feast on death instead of life. But every time they hit rock bottom, they cry out for help and God sends a rescuer. In the book of Judges, they're called judges, a judge to save them. Now, there is an awful lot to be sad about in the book of Judges, the things that people do to one another and to themselves. Even when in the presence of heroes like Shamgar and Samson and others, there's an awful lot to be sad about as we read these tales. But perhaps the saddest point is an observation that's made towards the conclusion of the book. Towards the end of the book, it says this, that in those days Israel had no king, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. You see, the people were supposed to have God as their king. This isn't a comment that they didn't have a human king. This is a comment that they'd abandoned the God who had rescued them. Instead of seeking him, they each sought their own wisdom, what was best for each and every one of them, which inevitably led to the worst for everybody else. It's an eerie echo of the sin that we encounter in the garden, the start of the book of Genesis. It's a million miles away from the wedding-like covenant that we had at Sinai. If you follow my commands, I will be your God, you will be my people, I will bless you. Instead of living differently from all of the other nations, it turns out that the Israelites desire to be just like the other nations. Instead of enjoying life in God, they once again are seeking out some sort of weird living death. And that brings us to the next section, to the rise of the kings in the book of Samuel. Samuel, usually divided up into our Bibles into 1 and 2 Samuel for ease of getting around, is named after Samuel, who was the final judge in Israel. It was Samuel who was called by God to anoint Israel's first king. An act of terrible rebellion, not against Samuel, but against God himself. The people's request for a king was not what God wanted for them at all. He wanted them to see him as their true king. But it is what the people wanted, even demanded, to be just like the nations around them. So God gives them the deepest desire of their hearts. He gives them Saul, who looks outwardly like the perfect leader, someone they would most certainly choose, taller, stronger, braver than anybody else. But he fails. He fails to follow God, and instead he leads the people into even more sin. And it doesn't take long until things go really bad under Saul's rule. Mercifully, God doesn't give the people over to this living death under Saul, but calls out David, someone who the people would never choose, and yet someone who is gifted to them by God. David, the shepherd boy turned giant slayer, is by no means perfect. His own life is filled with sin, and yet he is someone with a deep desire to serve and honor God. A deep desire for God's name and glory to go out. In all the instances when he falls, we find repentance following closely and quickly. Now, under David's rule and reign, the nation is united. The nation is fruitful. The nation multiplies just like God has promised. David even establishes Jerusalem as this central city, and things begin to look glorious. It's the moment where everything feels like it could and should last forever, so much so that David decides to build God a house much like his own palace, a place to permanently dwell amongst his people. But God hadn't commanded that. He reminds David that he is the one who blesses. He doesn't need a king or anyone else to provide for him. And so instead, he promises David that one of his descendants will sit on the throne forever. It's a promise that Jesus will one day come and never be deposed. After David comes Solomon, his son. He takes the throne. And though his reign starts strong, it ends in folly and sin and division, compromises which mean that at the death of Solomon, the nation is split, divided into Israel in the north and Judah in the south. What seemed so full of promise now feels like a disaster waiting to unfold. That's what we begin to read in the books of 1 and 2 Kings. We started with Joshua leading the people into the promised land. Then came the book of Judges, each rescuing the people when they turned away from God. We met Samuel, who anointed Saul and David as kings. And finally, we saw the glory and the downfall of Solomon. Now, what do you make of that rise and fall pattern? What do you make of the cycles of rebellion and sin in the book of Judges? Here's a question for you. We didn't touch on it, but how does the love story between Ruth and Boaz fit into it all? Leave your answers in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next overview video.